So I'm gonna start the recording now. Taylor, please, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Stefano, and thanks again for inviting me to give this virtual talk to everybody today. I'm sure folks are probably mostly in the UK, but maybe coming from all over the place. So apologies in advance for a little bit of the US centric nature of some of the work I'll be talking about today, but hopefully it's of interest regardless. So the presentation that I have prepared for you all today is an outgrowth of the general direction of the work I've been doing over the past several years, where I've mostly been working with a variety of different kinds of mostly unconventional data sets to map and measure phenomena that aren't usually captured in official data sources, or which are only indirectly captured through this data. And I will be getting to some examples of this work here in just a few moments, if you'll forgive me for a little bit of an introduction to the topic. But at the same time as I've been trying to actually work with this data to either answer new kinds of questions or produce alternative understandings of age-old questions, I've also been thinking a lot about the broader social context and implications of data and how data's taken on a central role in mediating or reshaping various social practices and processes. And this tension between the two parts of my work is at the heart of the presentation I'll be giving today, which is framed around a concept that I've been increasingly fixated on in the last year or so, which is opacity. As I see it, opacity has become a guiding logic of social life and the governance thereof, especially when it comes to the role of data in these processes. So in stark contrast to the narratives of 10, 15, or 20 years ago, I don't see data writ large as opening up a new era of transparency or openness, where regular citizens have unprecedented insight into the larger structures that dictate their life, much less the ability to meaningfully act on these structures. Instead, through the careful management of data as an actual object and a discursive fixation, knowledge about the world is increasingly rendered inaccessible, obscured, or even impossible. Rather than trying to keep outright secrets, governments, corporations, and other powerful institutions and individuals seem to have changed tack a little bit. Instead of being totally obscured, social phenomena are made fuzzy and nebulous, difficult to fully grasp unless you're one of a privileged few who's able to peek behind the proverbial curtain. I wouldn't say that we're completely oblivious to the structural forces or behind the scenes workings of our world. That's a lot of what many of us do as geographers, but I have this sense that we're made to be sure that we can never be totally knowledgeable either. And that gap between partial and complete knowledge is easily exploited, which I think is something that we've all seen and experienced over the course of the past year with the pandemic, whether you're in the US, the UK, or somewhere else. By continually leveraging the need to know precisely what's going on if we're going to take action on an issue of pressing importance, whether it's a global pandemic or something else, and casting doubt on the plethora of research that's often already been done, the search for perfectly accurate data becomes what Hannah Arendt called a substitute for action and a technique of evasion, which serves only to further destabilize the place of science in society. This sentiment is similarly echoed in David Harvey's infamous critique of the moral masturbation of mid-20th century positivist geographers, who are more focused on continually cataloging the injustices of the city than actually doing anything to change them. So opacity is a fundamentally epistemological problem that calls into question how we are able to know the world around us. But I would say it's also an epistemological problem that begets an ontological crisis. If it becomes nearly impossible to say with any definitiveness what actually is, well, I think we have ample evidence from recent years about what some of the effects of that are. So rather than producing more knowledge about or insight into the world around us, I would argue that sometimes, or maybe even oftentimes, data works to obscure our ability to know or understand, and therefore our ability to act, at least in an informed way. So whether because we don't have enough of it, because we have too much of it, or because we have the wrong kind, data often serves to reproduce the opacity of our social world as much as it does to remove it. And so all of this is ultimately to lead up to the point that I believe that at the same time as opacity represents this guiding logic of contemporary governance, it also represents a challenge for scholarly research. Because at the same time as data is making more and more aspects of social life opaque, it's also reinforced the idea that quantification is inherently more precise, certain, and maybe with scare quotes true, allowing us to search out and discover new fundamental laws of social life, something that many of us have maybe seen in recent years within strands of the so-called urban science literature. But all this demand for certainty and universality has really accomplished is quantifying in an extremely partial and error-prone ways ideas that we often had reasonably well established a full century or so ago. The data that we have easy access to and can run these increasingly advanced computational analyses on aren't necessarily the data that are helping us answer the most pressing questions about the world or uncover emerging forms of inequality that have thus far eluded our scrutiny. They're often data that just help us to kind of know what we already know a little bit better, maybe. And so I would argue that the real potential for progress when it comes to mobilizing GI science for the production of new social scientific knowledge comes from dispensing with the longstanding need for positivist certainties and instead embracing the fuzziness and contextually dependent findings that come from using these methods to help us dig into issues that aren't yet on our radar at all or that haven't yet been quantified through official means. And while the perfectionism that made me quit all kinds of different things when I was a child, because if I wasn't good at something on the first try, I usually gave it up pretty quick, would make it seem like this isn't a challenge I would want to take up, I, like most people, am a walking contradiction and contain multitudes. And so at the same time, I've been thinking about a lot of the features of this new mode of governance and how we got here and what the implications are. I've also continued working to answer questions that aren't so straightforwardly answered, questions that require me to grapple with the shortcomings of different data and methods, and ultimately embrace the fuzziness that comes with trying to answer these questions in the first place. Put simply, I am increasingly unsure that it's even possible to achieve the degree of certainty that we're taught to aspire for, but that doesn't mean we can't use some of the tools at our disposal to continue providing preliminary and partial answers and asking new kinds of questions in order to open up new horizons for scholarly research and ultimately, I would say, social change. So in approaching this work, I've drawn inspiration from the excellent work of scholars like Annette Kim, Sarah Williams, Jeff Boeing, and Jake Wegman, along with various colleagues of theirs and other scholars I don't have time or space to mention, who have all devoted considerable effort in recent years to uncovering previously opaque and difficult to study social processes, precisely by trying to grapple with the inherent fuzziness of this process of data production and visualization about issues that have been off of our radar previously. So from alternative understandings of public space and transportation networks to hidden segments of the housing market that have eluded easy quantification, this work by these scholars I've mentioned provides a real provocation for geographers, GI scientists, and others to be willing to work with imperfect and unconventional data, and maybe one might say unconventional issues as well, in order to expand our horizons and begin asking new questions and developing new ways of thinking. And so, as promised, I want to talk briefly about two projects I've recently completed and had published that speak to different aspects of this challenge that opacity provides us. And I'll end up going through each of these papers in turn with the rest of my time today. So one of these projects, undertaken in collaboration with Atta Porthouse, who was the featured speaker on this webinar series just about a month ago, and mentioned some of this work then. So if you were on Atta's webinar, I apologize for the duplication, as well as Matt Zook. This work focuses on trying to quantify the unquantifiable. This is the work that Stefano mentioned of developing a relational analysis of gentrification in Lexington, Kentucky through the lens of social media data. But there's this one other paper that I also want to talk about a little bit today, which approaches a different problem of trying to quantify something that's not already been quantified, but isn't impossible to quantify, but is ultimately still pretty difficult to quantify, which is this emerging phenomena of so-called game day homes in college towns of the American South. So if you've never heard of game day homes, that is perfectly all right. You can be forgiven for missing one of the 2 total national news articles to ever be written about the subject here in the United States, and prior to a few weeks ago when my paper came out, the complete lack of scholarly research published on the matter. But while living for 3 years in Starkville, Mississippi, as Stefano said, when I was working at Mississippi State University, Starkville is a small college town in this relatively isolated and rural corner of the poorest state of the US. And so I was immediately taken by the simultaneous similarities and differences between how housing injustice manifests in a place like Starkville versus New York City, or even a place like Lexington, Kentucky, that I'll be talking about here in a few moments. So even though Starkville's seen rising housing prices in recent years, like so many other places, this doesn't look quite the same as it does elsewhere. Instead of pencil-thin luxury skyscrapers or even hyper-modern conversions of single-family homes, in Starkville, the most visible manifestation of housing inequality is the proliferation of these so-called game day homes. Game day homes are second or third or fourth or fifth homes that are used by out-of-town visitors during home sporting events, especially college football games. And I mean here particularly American football, of which there are only 7 or 8 per year. Otherwise, these game day homes sit largely vacant for the rest of the year. They're largely not used for short-term rentals or anything else. Their defining feature is kind of their use during these very specific time periods, and then complete lack of use otherwise. So living in Starkville or any other major college town in the American South, one can't help but notice game day homes. Practically everybody has a game day home story, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. It's hard to miss these new developments popping up all over town with all of the windows completely dark except for a handful of weekends a year. While at the same time, this real estate represents some of the most expensive residential real estate in the city, though it's still fairly cheap by the standards of large coastal cities. But the thing about noticing all of these game day homes in my neighborhood in Starkville was that there just wasn't any real data on them. Nobody knew how many of these there were, and there weren't really any straightforward ways to try to figure it out. Like I said before, when I moved to Starkville in the summer of 2017, there really hadn't even been a single thing written on the subject. And so what I wanted to do with this project was essentially try to track the growth of game day homes, when they started popping up, how many of them there were, where they're located, how much they're worth, how they're changing the local housing market. And while Jake Wegman's recent work on ghost dwellings provides a useful template for understanding game day homes as a kind of tangential or subset of that same phenomena, the use of census data on different kinds of vacant properties isn't so useful for understanding some of the more specific questions I had about these new developments and how they're manifest on the landscape, especially when you're talking about doing this kind of research in a small town like Starkville that only has like 5 or 6 census tracts in total anyways, meaning that the scale and granularity of the data just isn't there to be able to answer more specific questions. And as I came to find out, due to some pretty lax record-keeping procedures in Starkville and a lack of willingness or capacity for sharing public data, creating a well-rounded picture of this phenomena using construction permit data and other administrative records was all but impossible. And so I had to make do with what was available. Ultimately, I used property ownership records from the Oktibbeha County tax assessor to identify a total of 1,422 properties in Starkville, or in the Starkville area, I should say, since not all of these are located within the city limits, that I suspected to be game day homes, amounting to roughly 10% of the total number of residential properties in the city. So in order to identify these potential game day homes using property ownership data, I identified any residential property that's owned by someone outside of the city or county, the kind of general Starkville area, where that property was the only one in Starkville owned by that particular individual or entity. And I should say that, speaking to the kind of inherent fuzziness that I'm talking about in the presentation today, there is a lot of room for both false positives and false negatives in the data. It might exclude absentee landlords who own a bunch of rental properties in the city along with a game day home for personal use, while also including a bunch of other absentee landlords who maybe own just a single property that isn't a game day home. So fuzziness is, absolutely a part of this kind of calculation, but I'll kind of talk you through what some of this means in practice, because as I said just a few moments ago, because this is such a relatively recent and unstudied phenomena, validating these numbers is a pretty big challenge. So not only is it impractical to try to do like a field survey of which properties appear to be vacant during the week, but then occupied on game day weekends in one city, much less trying to replicate that across different kind of contexts, it's unclear that any kind of large scale survey of owners might actually get the kind of answers we need to be able to parse out whether or not these are game day homes. And so the best we can really do is to compare our granular parcel level estimates against those top line city level numbers from the census that I mentioned a few moments ago, which according to 2017 American Community Survey 5-year estimates, Starkville is home to a total of roughly 2,600 vacant units, of which 822 are identified as being for a seasonal, recreational, or otherwise occasional use, while 663 are listed as the owner having a current residence elsewhere. And so this figure of 663 vacant units represents our lowest end estimate of possible game day homes in Starkville. And while this figure represents just half as many possible units as our property record-based estimate, I think it's kind of suspect that we would be on this lowest end because it implies that there would be over 1,900 other vacant properties in Starkville that are not in use at all, not for game day homes or anything else, especially at the same time as the vacancy rate has been increasing, so have both home values and rents, right? So it's hard to kind of make sense of all of these things happening at the same time while thinking that there might only be around 600 game day homes. So the likely number is probably somewhere between 663 and 1,422. But even using this most conservative estimate, we can say that at least 5% of Starkville's housing stock is taken up by likely game day homes, with as much as 10% being perfectly within the realm of possibility. Given that Starkville tends to be a bit behind the curve relative to some of the other college towns in the American South, I suspected that using these same kind of census metrics to compare the growth of game day homes in other college towns of the Southeastern Conference, the kind of dominant football-oriented conference in the American South, would show Starkville to be lagging behind. But in fact, this analysis shows that Starkville is right up there with the top of other SEC college towns, along with the other Mississippi and Alabama universities, as having the most significant incursion of game day homes into these local housing markets. So if you look a little closer at the lines I've highlighted here in red, you can see that the two Mississippi and two Alabama schools represent the only college towns in the Southeastern Conference where the percentage of vacant properties for seasonal use exceed 5% of the total housing stock. But one of the interesting, again, very fuzzy aspects of this data is that that number for the percentage of vacant properties with a residence elsewhere is extremely low for every other SEC college town, except for Starkville, which is still calculated to be over 5%. And to go back and compare these numbers to some of Jake Wegman's work on ghost dwellings in larger cities and metros in the United States, you can see that the only two metro areas in the entire United States, of at least large metros, that have such a large, largely vacant, intermittently used housing units taking up a larger proportion of their housing stock than Starkville are Miami, Florida at 5.2% and Mesa, Arizona at 7.9%. Even New York City, for all of its reputation as the largest absolute sink for such speculative capital in the United States, has only about 2% of its total housing stock sitting vacant for these reasons. So even though these forms of real estate speculation in college towns like Starkville are perhaps more mundane and on a less spectacular scale than those high-rise towers alongside Central Park, they also represent a more significant portion of the local housing stock here than almost anywhere else across the entire country. Even if you account for a lot of the fuzziness in the process of quantifying game day homes, and you take our lower bound estimate to be an overcount, I think it's still pretty startling to think of the fact that game day homes in Starkville, Mississippi are on par with processes of housing speculation in global cities that have received countless front page features in the New York Times. But the real utility of embracing these fuzzy estimates using these finer grained parcel level data is that we can answer questions beyond just how many game day homes might there be. Instead, we can understand where they are and how they're concentrated, and how they're reshaping urban space and flows of capital between Starkville and other places around the country. So we can take this point-based map of suspected game day homes and aggregate these points to understand the clustering of these properties in different areas of the city. And while the particular patterns here maybe aren't of much interest to our very kind of cosmopolitan and globally dispersed audience here this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, knowing how many game day homes there are in a given area can allow us to compare the presence of these game day homes to then the total number of residential properties in a place, to understand which places are dominated by this kind of necrotexture or pied-à-terre urbanism, as it's been called elsewhere in the literature. And so this map goes beyond simply identifying where game day homes are concentrated to highlighting those places that have the highest proportion of game day homes relative to the total number of properties in a given area. So while we know from earlier that somewhere between 5 and 10% of the total housing stock in Starkville is in likely game day homes, this map shows that some neighborhoods in the city see game day homes representing upwards of 50 or even 75% of the total properties in the neighborhood. So while we're operating on a much smaller scale in terms of both the absolute number of vacant units and their value relative to the kind of similar processes happening in places like New York, these pockets of Starkville are displaying precisely the same underlying dynamic that exists in those high-rise luxury towers. These are neighborhoods, developments, and buildings that aren't used by the citizens and residents of Starkville on an everyday basis for their utility as house and home, but are rather utilized by out-of-town investors as a place to park their additional capital and maybe occasionally to come party for a night or two every fall. While such translocal flows of capital can seem largely abstract, through the same means that we can identify game day homes in the first place through those property ownership records, we can also map the relational geographies of game day home ownership. As I've demonstrated in some of my other work on housing, this allows us to not just get an understanding of the spatial manifestations and concentrations of game day homes within Starkville, but also how this issue is manifest in the connections between Starkville and the other places where wealthy alumni and game day home investors are located. So far from the kind of spatial isolation that we might typically ascribe to Starkville, given that the city is 2 hours away from the largest actual, meaningfully sized city of note. It's not connected to the interstate highway system in the US. It has extremely minimal air traffic connections. We can see that game day homes represent a key way that Starkville is plugged into larger flows of capital and processes of accumulation that stretch beyond the boundaries of the city. And so just to wrap up this particular point, or this particular kind of paper, again, there's undoubtedly a level of fuzziness and imprecision to any and all of this data and analysis, but these numbers currently represent the best that we can really do with respect to this question, especially if we're interested in developing a reproducible or for, frankly, lack of a better word, scalable solution to being able to identify game day homes in different places. And while we can say that more precision and accuracy is always desirable, I would, sure, it would be great if we could figure out exactly how many game day homes there were at a certain point in time. privileging that kind of certainty in our analysis would lead us to the end result that we would just have no analysis at all. That, I would have avoided, going down this rabbit hole, and the issue of game day homes would continue to be something that we just didn't really have a good sense about beyond simply our kind of personal experiences. So I'm going to stop there really quickly and transition into our next bit of research. So I want to turn our attention now to this problem of gentrification, which I think represents a very different set of issues when it comes to this concept of opacity that I'm organizing my presentation around this morning. So with gentrification, we're dealing with something that's very much the opposite of the game day homes question. Gentrification has been written about extensively, right? This is not the first time that anybody has tried to measure and map gentrification. But at the same time, gentrification has long been considered a chaotic concept, with people struggling to come to a shared definition of the phenomena, and some even questioning whether it's a thing that actually exists at all. But as Dan Hamill and Elvin Wiley argued some 25 years ago, uncertainty over the extent of gentrification stems not only from the complexity of the process, but also from the difficulty of observing and measuring it. That is, it's not just about a lack of agreement on what gentrification is, but that even when we can agree on a shared definition of what it is, our definitions often don't match up with the data that's available to measure and map gentrification as it unfolds. Nonetheless, geographers and urbanists have spent considerable energy trying to do just this over the last several decades. And just for the sake of a heuristic, I've kind of boiled this down into three ways that they've done this. So first, right, mapping demographic changes using indicators like median household income, racial composition, and the educational levels of residents. Excuse me. The second is to map changes to the built environment, like changes in the average sale price or rapid changes in the value of homes, maybe even things like renovation permits or upgrades made to the building stock, right? These are also indicators that gentrification might be occurring. But each of these two ways of mapping gentrification that people have relied on neglects that one of the defining features of gentrification as a concept is the idea of displacement, that people are being forced out of a place as a result of these investments into the built environment and these incoming residents. But as I'm sure many of you are perfectly aware, there really isn't a good way of capturing this fundamental aspect of the process of gentrification. Even where data on household moves is available, it's a fraught process to identify why specifically a given person or household moved from one place to another. This perpetual uncertainty is undoubtedly a key aspect of how gentrification remains an opaque process that we've, for all that we do know about it, certain aspects of it remain kind of difficult to pin down. And so with gentrification, I think we can see that despite the proliferation of new data sources and analytical methods, not all aspects of urban life lend themselves to easy quantification or datafication. But one of the affordances of these new sources of data, especially with something like geotagged social media data, is that while it can't resolve these fundamental issues with respect to quantifying gentrification, it can provide us an additional perspective on this kind of perpetually vexing question. That is to say, our work on this paper and any other of the kind of work that I've done with Atta and Matt isn't arguing that social media or even any other source of data can revolutionize the study of gentrification or segregation or anything else. Our goal is not to produce the one single true way of quantifying something. It's instead to shed new light on processes that are of interest to us. And when that's the perspective that you take, this data can be immensely helpful. And the thing we found this data to be most helpful for in our previous work is understanding people's broad patterns of intra-urban mobility over relatively long periods of time, and then being able to view these patterns in the aggregate as indicative of connections between different people and places. Geotag tweets don't tell us everything about where an individual goes, how they got there, or why they were there, but they can indicate meaningful locations to people and how people make use of different parts of the city. So in relation to gentrification, we build on some of our earlier work using this data to develop what we call more relational conception of neighborhoods by seeing gentrification as representing a reconfiguration of the connections and relationships between different urban neighborhoods. While we would argue that understandings of relationality have always been present in gentrification research, I would say this has tended to be much more implicit. The idea that neighborhoods are not static, but instead change over time is a really basic way of capturing this idea. But a paucity of data that captures this relationality has really caused this understanding to recede into the background of such work. So rather than being limited to mapping gentrification's geographies based solely on where people sleep at night or understanding changes to the internal characteristics of neighborhoods, we can instead look at how relationships between places are changing. So in our recently published paper, we've sought to do this through a case study of Lexington, Kentucky, where we all either currently or used to live and work and go to school, and the city's gentrifying north side neighborhoods, which you can see here in this image. These two census tracts that are highlighted by the slightly darker line are the places that'll be of particular interest to you. And then you can see a little bit in the photos some of the kind of key hotspots, commercial establishments that are indicative of this process going on to kind of corridors in the surrounding residential neighborhoods. All of those black points you see on the map are individual tweets in the area. But so our goal was to analyze how the everyday mobilities of Lexington residents in these neighborhoods have evolved and changed as gentrification has intensified over time. And ultimately, I would say that because we're sidestepping this perpetual question of whether gentrification is actually occurring, because it is, or whether there's a single method or set of indicators one can use to identify it in any context, because there isn't, what we're instead able to do is zoom in on places where we know that gentrification is happening to understand other methods by which we can understand different aspects of the process, to approach it from different angles and develop richer understandings of what gentrification means and how it unfolds. So our analysis is based on a data set of all geotagged tweets within the greater Lexington area created between June 2012 and December 2017, extracted from the Dolly system at the University of Kentucky that Atta and Matt developed. So during this period, we collected a total of 4.6 million tweets by roughly 95,000 different users. And for a subset of 17,000 or so of these users, we were able to determine a most significant or quote unquote home location, even though it may not necessarily be where the person actually, lays their head at night, for each user using the criteria that you can see here. But the most important thing is that once we've established a home location for these users, we can then use all of the tweets a given user creates outside of their home census tract and draw links between this home location and other parts of the city that the user has visited. And then we do that over and over and over and over and over again and aggregate them all together to understand how these broader patterns of inter-neighborhood relation are evolving. And because we're interested in how these connections are changing over time, we also divided our data set up into two time periods. The first from June 2012 through December 2013, so about a year and a half, and the second from January 2014 through December 2017, so that we can capture some of these before and after effects of gentrification as it's taking hold in the north side of Lexington. So once we did this, our first step was calculating how many users' home locations changed between our first and second time period, basically thinking that if a number of users who previously had home locations elsewhere in the city during period one, then had home locations in gentrifying neighborhoods during period two, that might be an indication of shifts in people's residential patterns. Long story short, this wasn't really all that useful. Only like 11% of the total number of users had different home locations between the two time periods, and a very small number were actually related to either in-movers or out-movers from gentrifying census tracts. But again, we have the ability to see not only where people live or what their most significant location to them is on a day-to-day basis, but also where else they spend their time and where or whether changes in their kind of mobility patterns and in the visits these users kind of make to other parts of the city evolve along with gentrification. But once again, we don't really see much change in the structure of these relationships, with a couple of very small exceptions. On the whole, the patterns of mobility and the visits of Twitter users look pretty similar from time 1 on the left to time 2 on the right. And while this doesn't really conform with what we were expecting or hoping to find, this actually echoes and extends findings from elsewhere in the literature that basically neighborhoods mostly stay the same over time. They don't experience drastic change. The interesting thing is that what we're able to do with these maps and this analysis is show that this stability and neighborhood character isn't just about the internal characteristics of neighborhoods, but also how neighborhoods connect to one another relationally. And so even looking at the share of tweets in different census tracts that are from users who are visitors to that tract versus those whose home location is in that tract show remarkable consistency across our 2 time periods. And in both of these time periods, our gentrifying neighborhoods in Lexington actually see pretty low levels of visitor tweeting activity, especially when you compare it to the kind of downtown core neighborhoods just to the south of the gentrifying north side. And so across all of these slices of the data that I've just kind of shown you really quickly, we're not really seeing clear indicators that gentrification really is reconfiguring relationships between different parts of the city, at least as we can measure it through geotagged social media data. But it's at this point that by digging just a little bit deeper, we're able to uncover some interesting findings that help us to cut through some of the opacity of the gentrification process. And that is by looking at precisely where the visitors to the city's gentrifying north side neighborhoods are coming from. As you can see in period 2, on the right-hand side of this image, the number of visitors from around the University of Kentucky campus, which has the kind of small hatched line pattern, just a little bit to the south of those areas. So if you basically kind of see the black and white hatched lines. So visitors from those tracts around the University of Kentucky campus increased substantially in time 2, suggesting that these kind of long marginalized neighborhoods on the north side were increasingly attracting a population of students and others associated with the university. And by inferring the demographic profiles of these visitors using tract level demographic data from their home census tracts, we can begin to see the outlines of almost exactly what we'd expect based on the existing literature on quantifying gentrification, just with less of a focus on people's actual residential decisions and more on their kind of everyday mobilities. So looking at the leftmost column across all 3 of these variables, it's evident that the North Side neighborhood has lower educational levels, lower proportions of white residents, and lower median household incomes than other neighborhoods in Lexington's urban core. The second column shows that the average profile of visitors to the North Side neighborhoods is considerably better educated, whiter, and wealthier than the neighborhood itself, just as we'd expect with people that are actually moving into the neighborhood as part of the process of gentrification. And so the expectation would be that, right, as the North Side continues to gentrify, the average profile of visitors becomes better educated, whiter, and wealthier. And that is generally shown to be true if we look at this rightmost column in this figure with some important caveats. Notably, we see much greater differences in average educational attainment over time, with somewhat smaller or maybe mixed effects for both race and income across these 2 census tracts on the north side. And while this may seem to be confounding because of the centrality of race and class to the process of gentrification, we know that higher education is actually one of, if not maybe the best single quantitative indicator of gentrification. And that's because income is, of course, an extremely unreliable indicator for class. This is because young people, who are typically the harbingers of gentrification, early stages of their careers, and therefore unlikely to have substantially higher incomes than the average resident, even of a poor neighborhood. And even though their class position right, as seen through their educational attainment, professional careers, etc., is indicative of this substantive difference with longstanding residents. So all of that is to say, right, that the process of making sense out of social media data as an indicator of gentrification is extremely complicated and really isn't any less fuzzy or opaque than trying to map gentrification through any other methodology. But what is less important here is whether this provides some revolutionary insight into this long-studied process, I would say. And instead, we should focus on how this data and methodological approach can help us to better understand the fundamentally multifaceted process that is gentrification as it's actually occurring in a variety of different places. And so just to put a neat little bow on things and transition us into the Q&A, let me just reiterate a couple of the key things that I hope you all take away from the talk today. So first, basically that opacity represents this really significant challenge to scholarly research, and especially our ability to mobilize scholarly research for social change. Second, I would insist that we need to kind of dispense with the idea that data must be perfectly representative or deliberately collected or otherwise meet this kind of, almost unattainable standard in order for it to be meaningful or useful to us. And finally, as a result of this, that we should really embrace the fuzziness and uncertainty that's inherent in all data, but especially data that is of this present moment that is so structured by opacity, and that ultimately such an effort might allow for us to uncover new kinds of social phenomena and inequalities that would otherwise elude our analysis. And with that, thank you all so much for joining me for this today. I am happy to answer any questions that you all throw in the chat for me.
Thank you very much, Taylor. I invite everybody to a virtual applause. I think that was absolutely great. This is probably the most awkward part of giving a talk nowadays, that you can't really hear people applause or anything like that. It's a bit of like landing in nothing. But I think, it was really great. I have a bunch of questions myself. So if people do have questions, please do post them in the chat right now. And well, as chair, I will take chair privilege. And while maybe other people are typing out their own question, I will ask one of my own, which I think relates quite well to sort of like the last component that you presented, the last bits of your research about gentrification, and the use, especially in the use of tweets about gentrification. This is something that I've sort of like discussed with a few people, and I would like to see what you think about it. So gentrification in human geography has been largely, as you said, about displacement and as being largely about housing, whereas there are some components of the literature and also in the broader discussion, like in the public, gentrification is a lot about independent coffee shops and this kind of businesses coming up and sort of like this kind of signs of gentrification. I think Twitter, geolocated tweets might actually relate more to this second component rather than to the housing, because it's, very few people sit at home and tweeting about their home. People mostly tweet when they are out and about in the independent cafe. So what can you say, what you think about this?
Yeah, I think you're probably spot on with that. And I think that's one of the things that we are probably kind of indirectly measuring, especially with this particular case study of Lexington. Assuming that, the vast majority of people probably on the call have not been to Lexington, even though maybe some have, right? These two corridors that we're focusing on, especially in the surrounding residential neighborhoods, gentrification was really kind of kicked off there by commercial investments rather than residential investments. In the surrounding housing stock, that kind of followed later on after there was this draw for people to go to restaurants and bars and things like that. And so by focusing simultaneously on, how that particularity of our case, but also the idea that we're measuring not necessarily where people live, but where they are just going to on a day-to-day basis, that really is capturing these kind of commercial places. It's capturing breweries and bars and restaurants and cafes and things like that. So I think you're absolutely right. I think, there's obviously definitely a chance that in a different context, in a different city, there may be a way that people's tweeting activity may be more kind of confined to their primary residences. And so you could get a better sense of whether or not people's, home locations are changing or something like that. But by and large, I think you're exactly right that this is really capturing gentrification as being more than just a housing-based phenomenon, that it also has these kind of broader commercial, economic, cultural reference points that we see manifest.
Thank you so much. So I got 4 questions in the meantime, so I'm gonna read out loud them so that we have in them a recording. So we have one from Alexander, I guess. Apologies if I misread your name. Thanks for the talk. Are there measures of uncertainty in your work? How do you control for confounding factors on your observations?
Yeah, so we tend to not approach uncertainty right in the way that, a kind of conventional GI science approach to uncertainty would. We certainly, both in designing our analysis and then I would say especially in the way that we kind of approach interpreting the results that we get from various kind of analytical measures, try to take account for these kinds of things, right? And I think that one of the things that I would say is most useful, and especially in these 2 pieces of work that I presented, is that the things that are going to be most confounding, or the things that you're going to understand to be the most confounding, are not things that are, again, going to be measured quantitatively, but they're things you would only really understand if you actually know the landscape and you know the processes going on. And so because of our kind of intense familiarity with, either the Lexington gentrification case or on my own, the Starkville game day home case, right? I have more insight than just, taking what exactly numbers give me and trusting that I have to kind of account for that quantitatively somehow. So yes, but not through the way that maybe GI science would prescribe it to be. And I think that's part of what's, can still be good and interesting and productive about combining these approaches.
And I think this relates to some of the discussion we were having with Ate a few weeks ago about where we do studies. And one thing that I actually like about your work is that you actually do quite a lot of work around the places that you know and where you live. And what is there is an imbalance about a lot of the work being done in maybe large cities, and actually how does that affect the knowledge that is produced, but also how that affects what kind of what do we do, how we know about things that we are studying.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely a kind of key thing that I have picked up on, just because all of the places I tend to live are places that don't look a lot like the places that get the most, kind of attention, whether in the news media or on Twitter or communities or whatever, talking about these issues. And for a variety of reasons, the things that, people often offer up in those conversations don't make sense. It's not that I don't agree that, they're good, but things look different. This is fundamental insights of geographers, right? Sometimes things are the same everywhere. Sometimes they're different for a variety of reasons. And I think it's really important that we kind of take account of what a lot of those differences are.
Fantastic. I'm going to move to the next question. So this is from Faye. Thanks, Taylor, for the really interesting talk. You mentioned about scientists' willingness to work with imperfect data, but I wonder if you had any reflection on end user stakeholders working with imperfect data and outputs and the willingness to accept them, accept this as evidence.
Yeah, that's a great question. So my answer to this is, unfortunately, I think maybe a little bit scattered, because it'll go beyond just these couple of cases that I've talked to you all about today and extend into some things I've learned in other pieces of my work. But I think one of the things we're increasingly kind of aware of, particularly with this kind of post-truth, like kind of reactionary right-wing element to politics at all levels, is that essentially no matter what data you throw out, no matter how perfectly designed or collected or analyzed it is, there's going to be a significant contingent that calls into question its validity, right? That is going to be universal, no matter what. But one of the kind of flip sides of that is that can sometimes create conditions for productive kind of disengagement, for what I've seen other scholars refer to in some different places as like agonistic data practices, or contentious politics kind of around data, where data is really the battleground over political fights, right? Saying like, no, you actually have the wrong number here. You're misconceptualizing the scope or extent of this problem, and so you're not going to be able to address it accurately by doing that. But so because of those 2 points, I think it is a very sticky situation, and there is no kind of universal answer to it. I think because of it, imperfect data is kind of acknowledged to just be part and parcel of the kind of game that we're all playing. But also, that's not to say that it still can't produce issues, because if, I suppose that whoever is the first mover in a particular situation maybe opens themselves up to, more critique than if they are using data as a response to a kind of pre-existing dominant narrative. So I think there is a willingness, but yes, it certainly also comes with some, risks or challenges itself.
Brilliant, thanks. I'm gonna move on because we have a bunch of more questions came through. So the next one is from Helen. Really great and thought-provoking talk. Thanks. What are your hopes for how game day research will be used and built upon in the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I would love for college towns across the American South and elsewhere in the country, because this is a problem that exists elsewhere. I think it's just maybe most concentrated in some of these kind of southern small towns and cities. I would love for them to take up, a kind of harder line on taxing or regulating these kinds of properties, to discouraging this kind of out-of-town investment at such a large scale. I, will not hold my breath that such a thing will ever happen, both because, as I talk about just a little bit in the actual paper, there are a lot of incentives that localities have for encouraging this kind of development, just in the same way that, localities like gentrification, it increases the tax base, right? They're kind of more interested in that, and a classic kind of interlocal competition, urban entrepreneurial dynamic, than they are in, ensuring justice and equity for all of their residents. So there are good reasons that they have, or at least reasons that they have that they think are good for not doing anything to tamp down on this problem. But even if there were political will, I think one of the important things to consider is that, especially when you're talking about these southern college towns, even if you had local political will, since some of these cities are a little more liberal than maybe the states they're situated in, they are preempted by the state government from being able to make certain regulations beyond what's explicitly prescribed by the state. And so the opportunity is really limited. But I think if you look at certain elements of policies in the US, or policy packages like the Homes Guarantee kind of program that has been proposed, which was kind of developed in part as part of the Bernie Sanders political campaign in 2020, right? There are some very strong like anti-speculation, anti-absentee investing measures in policies that have been put forward like that. And I think maybe one of the things my research points to is that those have just as much, if not more, potential to impact some of these really small towns that, you know, are in the periphery of our view of things than they do, you know, for New York City and San Francisco and so on. So I would love for it to be taken up. I will keep banging the drum and say that, you know, this is as important or more important than things like, you know, regulating short-term rentals, even though I think that's a great idea too, or doing other things. But I'm not going to hold my breath and, you know, pin my hopes and dreams on that happening.
Sounds great. I think this is all the time, everything that we had time for, because it's already 2 o'clock, and I see quite a few people have already run away to wherever they had to be, and I know you also have other things scheduled for the day. So I think we'll close this here. Apologies for all those who have posted their question here. I will take note of these and send them to Taylor, but I don't have the contact. But if you want, I'm gonna post these are Taylor's contact in the chat. So please do get in contact with him via email, Twitter, or whatever you use. Thanks so much, Taylor, for coming and giving this talk so early in the morning for you today. And thanks everybody for joining.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming. I appreciate it.
Take good care. Bye-bye.
Bye.